I would say even if it rained today, a third of the corn crop is pretty badly hurt.
Mr. President, are you concerned?
Have you seen a drought like this before?
Mr. President, what do you think of all this?
Well, I think it's a great tragedy, as anyone can see.
In terms of the drought of this year, creating enormous human anguish, if greenhouse gases were to continue to accumulate, it's likely that such events would become more probable in the near future. There is no scientific debate any longer on this. CO2 is increasing at about 0.4% per year. It comes from man's activities.
We need some welfare assistance here. We have evacuees.
This would be the worst we've seen it by far. There's no sign of any of the vineyard at all. That's completely gone. Our two 5,000-gallon tanks are completely underwater.
It is vital for us to adopt a series of policy options, not just in New Zealand but everywhere, that ensures that the worst scenarios of climate change do not come to pass.
It was easy in 1988 and 1989 to think that you could have a public interest approach to dealing with greenhouse gases. Governments would say we must get these emissions down, their populations would agree and support that, and there would be no major lobby to block it. So I wrote, with two colleagues, a report in 1989 for the Ministry for the Environment, and at that stage we had, as far as we knew, political support.
In 1990, New Zealand's incoming national government set a target of cutting CO2 emissions by 20% in the next 10 years.
There's good news and bad news with regard to the New Zealand government's position. The good news is that they're in a cadre of progressive countries, relatively progressive countries, who've agreed to cuts in carbon dioxide emissions. The bad news is, however, that there is a widespread criticism of New Zealand that in actual fact is a paper target and that there's no policy furniture on the stage that will enable New Zealand to actually deliver.
The new Minister for the Environment, Simon Upton, was one of the youngest ever to be appointed to Cabinet.
The policy options which were talked about around the Cabinet table were serious policy options. That was the sort of world we lived in then. You know, we'd been through 6 years of Rogernomics, and then we'd had another round of reform with Ruth Richardson and so on. You weren't going to go for something fuzzy. If you were going to go for anything, you go for something reasonably crunchy.
I think there were two things about Simon. One was he was a great believer in science, and it was kind of hard for him to just ignore scientific evidence. And the second thing was, and maybe he was being a bit of a free marketeer here, but he thought that climate change could be controlled by putting a price on carbon emissions. And so, you know, if you did that, then the market could work the way it ideally should.
42% of carbon emissions came from the coal and gas burning industries, such as electricity, steel, cement and paper producers. One of the biggest of those, owned by the giant International Paper, was Carter Holt Harvey.
Simon Upton used to consult very widely, and I went to a couple of meetings at his house where we talked about carbon taxes, cap and trade systems, policy options. And it was noticeable that the chief of Carter Holt Harvey was present at those meetings and clearly already performing a role of keeping an eye on what Simon Upton was up to and checking him from going down the more radical options.
some of my colleagues were saying, look, hold it, I mean, aren't we just racing in here? They felt they were in very uncharted waters. This was a case for moving cautiously. I mean, one of my colleagues kept saying, oh, look, Simon, you know, we want no regrets here. Now, Paul, you can just tell me.
Simon Upton and his officials decided on a low-level carbon charge. Polluting companies would pay a maximum of $10 per tonne of CO2 emitted. This would encourage them to switch to renewable energy and fuel-efficient machinery and methods. New Zealand's greenhouse emissions would then come down. After 4 years of preparation, Simon Upton took the proposal to Cabinet.
I was part of the group that led that officials' advice to ministers saying, we need to do something. The best form of policy action is to introduce a price on carbon.
So then the debate was, okay, well, do we go for a carbon charge now, or is it too early? And of course, those who were concerned about a new tax, a new regulatory intervention, said, well, look, we can do a lot through voluntary instruments, you know, voluntary measures. Companies can do things.
The National Cabinet adopted the idea, so they agreed in principle to introduce it, but they put it on a leash. They said, well, we'll bring it in 1997, but look, if these voluntary agreements work, we won't need to.
Industry is warned that we have that 3-year time horizon, and if we're not making progress, then heavier guns will be brought into bear, so to speak. Argued since, but we accept that we can't just rely on...
New Zealand's main electricity generator, Electricorp, soon announced plans for a gas-fired power station that would increase the country's CO2 emissions by 5%.
Was a great big block of emissions potentially coming on stream, and the only tool we had available to do anything about it with was the Resource Management Act.
Under that act, Simon Upton called in Electricorp's proposal and appointed a board of inquiry to hear public submissions on the station.
It threatens New Zealand's ability to meet our international climate change obligations to cut emissions of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide.
Electricorp was permitted to build the station, but had to plant up to 4,500 trees each year to absorb the carbon dioxide emitted.
It's the first time a project has been called in by the government, and I think it'll set the stage for anyone who wants to develop power plants. This was the start of a new era. From the Electricorp point of view, our big debate was, what's it going to cost to do this? Does it change the cost of the plant? Because if it changes the cost of the plant, well, it may not be profitable.
That has to apply to all industry.
Every fuel burning industry?
Every fuel burning. Every application, no matter how big or small, that burns fuel.
I think the government has to now decide whether it believes that is the most sensible way of solving the problem, or whether we need some other measure.
That was exactly the nightmare that Simon needed to take to his cabinet colleagues, of all these court hearings under the RMA. So that then led to Simon getting his colleagues' agreement to set up what was called WOGACOP, the Working Group on Carbon Dioxide Policy, and he appointed me to that, along with a number of other people who were thinking along similar lines.
He did something quite unique at the time. He combined some private sector people with public servants, public sector people, to put together a working group that brought a pretty broad range of perspectives.
The idea is that if you've got respected people in the business community saying, look, it's a real problem and this is the best sort of policy mechanism, that gave the government a basis for moving forward with a bit more confidence than if it had simply done that work inside.
There is now overwhelming evidence that Earth's climate has changed. We live in a much different world, climate-wise, than people lived in 100 years ago. Earth is warmer, and it's going to change even more in the future.
In the United States, the oil and coal industries were funding a PR campaign to discredit climate change science.
It's fashionable these days to blame everything on global warming, particularly on man-made global warming, but I'm afraid the evidence doesn't point in that direction.
Fred Singer had been brought to New Zealand by the Business Roundtable, a pro-free market lobby group whose members were heads of major corporations.
We put out a lot of research, submissions, papers to government inquiries and the like, and essentially what we hope is that if we've done our homework well and the arguments are good, then sooner or later people will listen to us.
It was an ideological issue. Climate change requires regulation, regulation is bad, therefore we will oppose the idea that climate change has to be confronted. In the Business Roundtable view, a serious attempt to block greenhouse gas emissions globally would give new legs to a regulatory agenda that they were trying to kill off.
The Business Roundtable next flew out Richard Lindzen.
Certainly, the observed changes in temperature are still well within the range of normal variability.
The Business Roundtable chose big names, they spent a lot of money. It wasn't like the normal sort of industry lobbying, you know, where people are going along saying, well, look, this is what's going to do the bottom line of this company or that company. It was always much more sort of philosophical, intellectual sort of plane. So it was always fun, but one was always aware that the Business Roundtable wasn't going to really choose people who didn't sow the seeds of doubt.
So you have this small amount of warming, whether you want to worry about it or not. It has more to do with your psychology than anything else. It encourages growth, it increases water resistance, you know, drought resistance of plants. It does all sorts of nice things.
He certainly does have some very, very heavy criticisms to make of the scientific debate and the way it's been put together. And I think that they really are at one extreme.
That's a very good idea, to hear scientists talking to each other so that the points of difference between them can be better understood.
I was reasonably well informed about the science, so when Richard started doing his ABC for beginners, I was reasonably well equipped to say, yes, well, I know all that, and add a few more facts. And so then he changed tack and started to say that what really worried him was that this reminded him, you know, of the debate over eugenics in the 1930s. My eyebrows raised at that point. The world had been steamrolled into a dreadful thing, trying to pick a genetically superior race. The whole climate thing smacked of the same sort of activist pressure. I thought somewhat stunned by that and suggested to him that there really didn't seem to me to be any connection between eugenics and climate change. But it was an interesting line to try.
By June 1996, Simon Upton's Working Group on CO2 Policy, WOGOCOP, was ready to release its report.
We had two recommendations. One was to set up an emissions trading scheme in the long run, which was going to take a certain amount of time. And then as an immediate step, we recommended an interim carbon charge.
You get something like climate change coming along, it changes the existing status or merits of various activities. There are winners and losers. And anyone who thinks they're going to be a loser is going to try and protect their position. And it's very natural that if you've got change in your environment, you coalesce with all those who are affected in the same way to try and influence that the policy that emerges. And that was exactly what happened, of course.
A week before the report's release, the Greenhouse Policy Coalition was formed. Its members included Coal Corp, Carter Holt Harvey, New Zealand Steel, Comalco, the New Zealand Oil Refining Company, and Melbourne Cement.
Sure, we're emitters, but we're doing more on the ground than probably most of the community put together because it's in our best interests to do so.
The coalition accepted climate change was happening, but lobbied to limit the government's response.
And they made a lot of submissions against our report, and they lobbied ministers. And so Simon, as Minister, found himself in quite a difficult position in getting the Cabinet to agree to the recommendations of our report. He just pushed it as far as he could, but he couldn't get it over the threshold because of the opposition of the Greenhouse Policy Coalition people.
It really was probably a bit naive for us to believe we could have pulled it off as quickly and easily as maybe we thought we could at the outset.
The 1996 election saw a change to MMP, mixed member proportional representation. To retain power, National would need the support of minor parties.
Flat tax is an idea whose time has come.
The neoliberal ACT Party was backed by wealthy corporate donors opposed to action on climate change.
I was one of a number of environmentalists who formed a little party called the Progressive Greens, and we hope to get a few seats in Parliament.
We're going to put a list of policies up that we'd like our coalition partner to support, and we'll see who will give us the best deal.
We did go through a phase of registering as a party and sending out letters to people asking them if they'd give us some money. And in response to one of those letters, we got invited into the Carter Holt Harvey boardroom. It became obvious that the main issue, which would affect whether that company would give us a donation, was whether or not we would introduce a carbon tax if we had some influence over it. We refused to back away from our policy on a carbon tax, and so we never got a donation.
The Progressive Greens failed to win any seats. National returned to power, forming a coalition government with New Zealand First and the ACT Party.
To see these cracks riven through these massive bastions of ice which have been around for hundreds and thousands of years was shocking. What the science is telling us and what we saw on the expedition is that temperatures in Antarctica, and particularly the Antarctic Peninsula, are increasing rapidly. This is consistent with what is happening all over the world, and what is happening all over the world is likely to be due to human activities.
New Zealand's CO2 emissions had increased by 7% since 1990 and were rising faster than most OECD countries. Relying on industry to voluntarily reduce emissions had failed.
Of course, it doesn't work. They almost never do what's needed. Sometimes they do a little bit, and that's enough to mollify the public. But typically you need regulation or you need a price instrument. The government actually has to do something firm and effective.
It was 1997. Cabinet now had to decide whether it would go ahead with the postponed carbon charge.
By then the industrial opposition to a carbon tax had really gathered momentum and was on a roll. Right-wing voices were very strong both at cabinet level and in Parliament.
We were within a few months of Kyoto, where there was to be a protocol negotiated. So the mood, I'm sure, at the time was, look, it's premature. Don't go and put a carbon tax in place. We don't know what's going to come out of Kyoto. We should sign off on that first.
In December 1997, the United Nations Conference on Climate Change took place in Kyoto, Japan.
Trading is simply the most powerful tool available to us, and it must be developed. It will expose every business and every citizen to the costs of their emissions.
The aim was to establish a treaty to reduce world emissions. Each country would negotiate its own target, a percentage cut of its 1990 level.
When it came to the actual targets that were set, I never had to do any negotiating because the real negotiation was between the big guys, and I can recall being sequestered in a corridor by Ambassador Estrada, who was chairing the conference, and he said, look, he said, you know, we understand the position New Zealand's in. How about zero? Well, I actually had negotiating authority if the sign-up was big enough to go to -5, but I was never even asked if we go further, just how about 0? I thought it was a pretty good deal at the time, so that's how New Zealand came to have 0.
Negotiations stalled. The US would not allow less demanding targets for developing nations.
The biggest obstacle of all is the US government, which seems to have swallowed the fossil fuel industry argument that not much can be done, that delays are inevitable.
I'm really concerned. Perhaps we are about to blow up the whole possibility of having the agreement.
After speaking on the telephone from here a short time ago with President Clinton, I am instructing our delegation right now to show increased negotiating flexibility.
By the time the formal closing time of the meeting came, we didn't have an agreement. I had to catch my plane home without knowing what the outcome was going to be. It was hammered out in the small hours of the next morning, 4 o'clock in the morning, when everybody's so exhausted they'll kind of agree to anything, and they've lived on nothing but coffee since last night.
The US had accepted lower targets for developing countries in exchange for smaller reductions in its own emissions.
After a marathon session, the United Nations Conference on Global Warming has reached an agreement. It still has to be finally ratified, but the hope is it'll mean a target reduction of 5% in greenhouse gas emissions worldwide.
Now that action, as envisaged by Kyoto, is relatively modest. But at least if we've taken action, we've developed the systems, we understand how we'd go about making further reductions, we're on the road.
While Simon Upton was in Kyoto, Prime Minister Jim Bolger was ousted by Jenny Shipley.
I look forward to serving Her Majesty the Queen, Your Excellency, and the people of New Zealand to the best of my ability.
National MPs wanted a more corporate-friendly leader.
Jenny Shipley didn't want to do anything on climate change. She was opposed to acting, and so she stalled, and not much happened, basically.
It simply got pushed to one side. No one had a stomach for getting into something like that when they were much more focused on how on earth were we going to survive the next election. It was a very distracted environment.
The Stratford Power Station soon opened. Each year it produces 1.5 million tonnes of CO2. Several thousand trees were to be planted annually to offset these emissions. To date, not one tree has been planted.
There we go. So how does it feel to be at this stage of the game?
Feels good. No, it's going to be a great day, I think. All the indications are we're doing very well. There's a lot of support there, and people are feeling really positive about the message we're putting across.
After 9 years of a national government, the Labour Party took power. Helen Clark became Prime Minister.
New Zealanders want a change of direction. We're on the cusp of a new century, and we can have a fresh start.
Labour formed a centre-left coalition with the Alliance Party, supported by the Greens.
Congratulations, well done.
We are now into a new era of industrial relations where people will be first. So goodbye Employment Contracts Act, off to the dustbin of history, you and me!
If this imposes costs on business, if it imposes caution on business, if it stops businesses from employing and from moving forward, the cost is going to be on New Zealand, on all of New Zealand.
Those making investment decisions in the major capital markets size up the big picture. Right now, their general assessment is pretty simple. Old-fashioned left-wing government, outdated policies, bad returns, sell.
I did a lot of meetings, breakfast meetings, lunchtime meetings. So the indications were that the business investment might not continue into the future, and that would have impacts upon growth, employment, and indeed, obviously, the success of the government at successive elections. So it was very concerning to us.
What people have been saying to us is, look, hang on, we need to open the ears a bit more. And I think that's the message that we've picked up. We cannot move New Zealand forward to where we want it to go without being in partnership with business.
There was a heightened sensitivity to any area of policy change that was seen as a risk to further inflame that relationship with business. So it spread across a whole range of things that the government was trying to do or change.
Climate change policy is the hardest policy area I've ever had anything to do with. I've been a minister of 14 different portfolios. Climate change is the hardest. It's the hardest because you're having to deal with something that hasn't yet arrived. Climate change is something that's arriving in the future, not arriving now. It's the hardest because it seems to spread itself across everything to do with society, but mainly it's difficult because it's complicated.
We believe that in addition to a broad framework for energy efficiency and the development of renewables, we also need some financial incentives to people to reduce their use of fossil fuels. We have long advocated a low-level carbon charge.
Pete Hodgson began preparing carbon charge legislation to take to Cabinet.
We'd like to see it this year. We've got quite a reputation for New Zealand to overcome. It did get the Fossil of the Year award last year from the non-governmental groups for being so slow on these issues. We want to change that reputation.
Now, I think it would be irresponsible of the government to commit New Zealand to anything of this nature, which is so significant, without giving the community an opportunity to debate what the cost is and whether it's willing to accept it.
The Greenhouse Policy Coalition began a major political campaign against the carbon charge. They hired top PR firm Saunders and Unsworth.
We don't tend usually not to go around politicians knocking on doors saying, why don't you support this or support that? What we would do is advise the clients that this is the political climate, these are the people who have influence, this is the way perhaps you should present your case, these are the people you should see, these are the sort of things you should do.
The industry lobbyists used an inside access strategy. They targeted right across the spectrum of government departments that had power on this issue. So they looked at Treasury, they looked at the Ministry of Economic Development, they looked at MAF, they looked at MFE, the Ministry for the Environment.
They commissioned Alex Zundakov of the New Zealand Institute of Economic Research to write a report on the effect a carbon charge would have on the economy.
The NZIER has a long and very respectable history. But then, like most consultancies in New Zealand, in the 1990s, economic consulting became highly politicised, and the money went to the consulting groups that produced the right results from the client's point of view.
Before releasing it publicly, the Greenhouse Policy Coalition sent the NZIER report to Helen Clark. The CEOs of Carter Holt Harvey, the dairy processor Fonterra, and the Tiwai Point smelter were then to meet with her privately.
They weren't trying to argue, a la US Republicans, that this was all some kind of myth, global warming, and shouldn't actually believe it was real. They were essentially saying the cost should fall somewhere else and shouldn't fall on them.
A few days later, the report was officially released at Parliament.
Economic activity could fall by as much as 1% each year, reducing GDP growth from 2.5% on average to 1.5%.
The minimal cost we're looking at would be in hundreds of millions of dollars. If you're talking about 1% of GDP, that's $1 billion a year. Now, That's a really, really large number.
You get an initial news hit when you produce one of these things, but actually what you're really buying with it, there's usually somewhere in it some sort of hero number, and the next sort of 30-odd news reports gets repeated.
One of the most impressive things from the lobbyists' perspective is the extent to which they were able to frame the debate as an economic issue. And I looked at all articles that were in the Dominion Post and the New Zealand Herald over that time and found that only 8% of them actually mentioned the environment. Once something looked at the economic dimensions of the issue, it was twice as likely to be pro-business.
Alister, I guess this confirms your fears, does it, this report by the NZIER?
Well, it does. It shows that the costs are much greater than the government has so far estimated, and the main concern of business is that we do get an accurate handle on what the cost might be.
Guy, the figures do sound alarming in terms of the impact on our GDP. Do you accept them?
No, I don't think so. There are a few sectors that are going to be feeling a stronger effect. They are the people that have commissioned this report, and of course this report's been very much dressed up to suit the client. So it actually is quite difficult to properly engage with these kinds of things, partly because you can't do it fast enough, because they're secret until they're released, and partly because environmental groups often just don't have access to the level of expertise, and they certainly don't have the ability to do what the Greenhouse Policy Coalition did, which was to have an economist really as part of their lobby team going around Parliament, paid to provide authoritative, in quotes, authoritative answers to all these questions.
The question was whether there would be a carbon charge coming in straight away or whether it was going to be pushed out. It came down to, a political judgment by the Prime Minister and Michael Cullen about the extent to which it was wise to go there at that particular stage of that government's life, really.
Pete Hodgson's carbon charge was postponed for 5 years.
The Greenhouse Policy Coalition was successful in frightening his ministerial colleagues out of going ahead with the carbon tax in exactly the same way they'd frightened Simon Upton's cabinet colleagues from going ahead with his carbon tax.
By 2002, parts of the Antarctic ice sheet were losing 10 metres in thickness each year.
If we look at the Franz Josef Glacier, since the late 19th century, it's retreated in the order of 2 or 3 kilometres. If we get warming and a drier climate setting in, it will mean that glaciers like the Franz and Fox start retreating up their valleys further.
Most of the analyses that have been done looked at a doubling of CO2 in the atmosphere, and everything we know about the impacts is really based on that doubling of CO2. But if the big emitters don't reduce their emissions, you're actually well on your way to a tripling, and that's something that we haven't even begun to look at.
With his carbon charge on hold, Pete Hodgson pulled together what remained of his proposals and called them foundation policies.
Why are we waiting till 2007 to instigate these measures? Why not immediately or at least next year?
We are not waiting until 2007. What we've got is we've got the foundation policies, the National Energy Efficiency and Conservation Strategy, the waste strategy because of methane out of landfills, the transport strategy for obvious reasons. We've got projects, negotiated greenhouse agreements, we've got research.
What they've come up with is just a whole sort of ragbag of little policies, none of which give us a sort of consistent approach to really cutting back.
Under one policy, big emitters could negotiate exemptions from the future carbon charge.
The idea was that certain companies would take action to cut emissions, and they shouldn't be jeopardised when a carbon tax came in for reductions that they'd already made.
The objective of the negotiated greenhouse agreements is to ensure that the big emitters, the big energy users, stay put in New Zealand.
The obvious difficulty with the negotiated greenhouse agreements approach is that industry has got all the information about their plants. They can completely pull the wool over the eyes of the officials who haven't got the means to challenge that analysis. The negotiations seem to go on forever. That was exactly what industry was trying to achieve.
There's a real chance if we impose costs here that one, our businesses will move overseas, and two, will discourage investment that might have happened otherwise.
The Greenhouse Policy Coalition was there to deliver the goods for the carbon barons of our society, and the main good that they got to deliver was delay. So whenever we did something, they would say, "You're going too fast," and I'd say, "We've been at this for a year." "Well, goodness me, we've only just come upon it," you know. And the whole issue, from their perspective, was to ensure that not much happened yet, and that's the easiest thing in the world. What I had to do to succeed was to make sure that something happened.
Contact Energy began planning a new gas-fired power station.
The vision of meeting New Zealand's energy demand growth from renewable generation sources is almost impossible.
Genesis Energy signed contracts increasing CO2 emissions from its Huntly power station by 25 million tonnes a year.
Well, we certainly have had to increase our coal consumption significantly. The gas entitlements that we've had over the last 10 years were wound down.
Solid Energy announced plans to build 2 new coal-fired power stations.
What 3 years ago was about 3 million tonnes of coal being mined by us a year is going to be something like 7 or 8 million tonnes in the next 5 or 10 years. Coal is not a renewable resource, but it's a bit like having money in the bank when you die. It doesn't do you much good. So the smart thing for New Zealand to do with our coal is to mine it, to use it wisely, to use it to create energy, which adds value to the economy, and to create economic value that will have a lasting purpose on its own. And that way, coal can almost be a sustainable resource.
We are not going to cut back the use of fossil fuels. I promise you that. We're not going to do it. And in my view, the utilization of fossil fuels will grow in the United States.
By December 2002, the United States and Australia had decided not to ratify the Kyoto Protocol.
The President has been unequivocal. He does not support the Kyoto Treaty.
Does the Minister acknowledge that if we do ratify ahead of those countries, that we will place our economy at a comparative disadvantage in view of the fact they are our key trading partners?
Speaker,
Honourable Pete Hodge.
I most certainly and emphatically do not. I will say to the member that the New Zealand economy will be benefited, albeit modestly. The New Zealand economy will be benefited by a decision to ratify. We are one of the few nations who are...
Well, just minutes ago, there came a moment in Parliament that some business lobbyists were dreading and environmentalists were waiting to celebrate. Yes, New Zealand has signed up to the Kyoto Protocol on climate change.
In ratifying the protocol, we now begin to follow through with the action necessary to achieve real reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. Pete, thank you for the particular effort and commitment you have brought to this.
It's serious feel-good grandstanding. None of New Zealand's major trading competitors are going to face the implications, take the hits that New Zealand will, with ratification of the Kyoto Protocol.
A survey showed 47% of New Zealanders favoured ratifying the treaty. 6% were opposed, 42% said they needed to know more.
The information that we got from polling was that it was all drifting along with a public that was in two minds about it, not particularly engaged with the idea of that climate change was happening, possibly uncertain as to, who was right and who was wrong.
What they found is that the ice is melting around the edge of Antarctica. It's always melted around the edge of Antarctica at some rate or other. The fact does not, to me, indicate that they've got concrete evidence of global warming.
It was a constant part of the job to deal with the problem that the reporting of the science of climate change would always be balanced in the minds of those that were doing it by finding one of the dial skeptic talking heads to respond by saying it was all rubbish.
If there is global warming, it's of a mild nature. I think we should look forward to a very pleasant next 100 years climatically, and there's certainly no reason to believe otherwise.
There is a group of people in New Zealand who, right from the beginning, have worked really hard to spread an opposing point of view to climate change. And they have got, through various means, an enormous amount of coverage. When you follow that group all the way back, you end up with American libertarian think tanks, the Heartland Institute and the Competitive Enterprise Institute, who have given serious amounts of money to spreading this campaign of doubt.
The Heartland Institute ran PR campaigns funded by ExxonMobil, oil magnates and wealthy industrialists.
The science is proving the Earth is cooling, not heating up. And many climate scientists around the world dispute alarmist claims and celebrity science. They like to tell you the planet is dying and we must save it at any cost. They like to scare you. We don't. We're the Heartland Institute. Global warming. Was it ever really a crisis?
A Heartland-funded scientist was brought to New Zealand by the Business Roundtable.
Don't deceive yourself believing that there's a whole lot New Zealand's going to do straight up that'll ever reduce CO2 emission globally or at all affect global climate. They came to me and said, would you go out and appear at different functions for me? So I guess you're right. I would become something of a PR man for the boys, but the fact is they don't tell me what to say. I'm still out there representing the science as I see it.
Quite a big part of what I had to do was to try hard to array people to take the opposite position, as well as me. So I would, for example, ring up Greenpeace and say, could you please cane me harder for lack of action? Because I need to be told off by you guys. You've gone off to save whales again. Leave the bloody whales out of it. We've got a greenhouse a gas issue going on here and I'm losing it, so would you beat up on me a wee bit more?
Simon, surely business should be worried about air pollution.
Absolutely. But the question is whether Kyoto is an effective vehicle. In fact, its wheels are starting to fall off one by one.
Well, I'd put it back on Simon that business is playing its role in seeing that the wheels might fall off Kyoto. New Zealand is taking a strong leadership role in signing Kyoto. However, the delay of 5 years in bringing in the carbon tax, we don't believe is good for industry or good for the Kyoto Protocol.
It's just nonsense. It's nice to hear something from Greenpeace about climate change at all, actually, but what they've said is nonsense. New Zealanders are concerned and probably, on average, will be pleased that this country has begun to do something.
About 47% of our current emissions are from agriculture. The inclusion of the agricultural sector in any sort of carbon pricing regime was always a crucial part because it's a significant part of New Zealand's emissions profile.
Farm animals release methane into the atmosphere largely through belching. Their decomposing urine produces nitrous oxide in the soil.
Methane, for sure, is a difficult one for farmers to do anything about without reducing their stock numbers. But with nitrous oxide, which is 17% of New Zealand's total emissions, they could easily reduce their emissions, particularly by getting cows off wet soils during the winter.
The Kyoto Protocol itself, do you go along with it or not? I mean, in theory, or...?
Well, we're a bit worried. The science behind this seems to be 50-50. A lot of our trading competitors have not signed up to it, and it's going to put us pastoral farmers in New Zealand at a disadvantage.
The farming lobby's always been extremely powerful in New Zealand because it's such a large part of our GDP and our exports, and they know that. And I think the decision was made early on. We've got to nip this in the bud before it gets started, because if we allow anything to happen, who knows how it will accelerate and where it will lead to.
Farmers were exempted from the carbon charge until 2013.
But what we are requiring is for farmers to contribute to a scientific effort to look for answers, look for solutions to the greenhouse gas generation of pastoral agriculture.
There is some evidence that feeds containing condensed tannins, which are a protected protein, may be able to reduce methane emissions.
Farmers would have to pay an annual research levy of about $300 per farm.
New taxes seem to be dreamed up every day. This is another one that Federated Farmers feels that New Zealand, the farmers, shouldn't be paying for something that's for the good of all New Zealanders.
The government is paying for research at the rate of about $5 million a year. We need to do more research, and farmers can pay for some of that research. That seems to me fair.
And that's hardly fair without compensation. The 70 cents, that'll turn into $1. All taxes end up going up.
All the contractors, the general community is right behind us in this one. They all think it's as ridiculous as we do.
This is for an amount roughly equivalent to your Federated Farmers subscription.
We see it very much as an attack by the government on the agricultural sector and the very productivity that drives the New Zealand economy.
Frankly, I trusted Federated Farmers. They were in my office often, negotiating how we were going to get this thing done. They were acting, I thought, in good faith, and all the time they were preparing this campaign.
The fart tax campaign worked like a charm because climate change was such a difficult, complex story, and here was something that boiled it down to a joke about farts. You know, brilliant. So you didn't have to worry too much of your reporter about the ins and outs of all that sort of stuff, because you could use the word fart day after day on the news or in the paper, and what could possibly go wrong?
Thank you, Auckland, for your support, and throughout the country for the 84% who said that they support farmers.
Tax the people who are ripping the fishes off out of the sea or something silly like that, not bloody cows. Give them a break.
It was almost impossible to explain. Almost impossible to explain that it's belching, not farting, that they didn't have to pay the carbon tax, they were just being invited to do a bit of research.
We won't pay the fart tax, no bloody way! We're showing the government something, aren't we? Aye?
Soon ACT and the National Party joined in.
Good morning, Mr. Prewell.
They think that they can sit down there in their shiny bums in that Parliament building and roll over this group. They have made a mistake.
Climate change is the most important long-term environmental problem facing this country, and it will hit farming first.
We don't believe you, please! We don't believe you! Bullshit! 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 Bullshit!
It wasn't an argument about climate change, really. It was about the relationship between a Labor government and the farming sector, which has never been Labor's friend. And it was a golden opportunity to give the government a good pasting.
Good evening. There's been an embarrassing backtrack for Helen Clark's government on the tax that got farmers all fired up. Plans for the so-called fart tax have been scrapped.
Farmers have got everything they wanted and aren't spending one more cent than what they have been in the past.
This was a political debate amongst many that I had in the climate change arena where I lost hands down. That's it.
As the snow falls in this area, it layers up year by year, and in each of those layers is a record or like a memory of the chemistry that was in the atmosphere at that moment.
New Zealand really fits well into our big picture in terms of being able to get a better understanding of climate change. In order for us to ever begin to really be able to predict a longer-term future climate, we need to be able to understand what's happened in the past.
What we're seeing in the last 200 years is a rate of change that we just haven't seen before. And we see these drop stones. They tell us there was ice floating around and glaciers nearby. This has never been more relevant. There are some processes that could be quite dramatic that could happen in our lifetime.
By the end of the century, we'll have a climate that we last experienced on Earth about 40 million years ago, and that's well before humans. Well, it's before civilizations, but it's also even before humans evolved.
In October 2003, neoliberal banker Don Brash became leader of the National Party.
The Kyoto Protocol is based on very uncertain science. We see no reason to apply a carbon tax at all, at least through the so-called first commitment period to 2012, and if we're the government, we'll scrap it.
I remember talking with Don about why he was so sceptical about climate science. And he said, look, I've only spoken with 3 people about this issue. And he named 3 people who are, the 3 main climate sceptics in New Zealand. And I said to him, look, Don, none of these people have any track record in the peer-reviewed scientific literature. The great majority of scientists actually think there is a serious problem that we should do something about.
This is going to set out that Don Brash can actually deliver the goods. The election is 18 months away, but they're effectively starting their campaign now, and they need a recipe for success.
Too many Maori leaders are looking backwards rather than towards the future. The treaty did not create a partnership. We will remove the anachronism of the Maori seats in Parliament. We must build a modern, prosperous, democratic nation based on one rule for all. Thank you very much.
National's campaign against special treatment for Māori seems to be paying off. National, under Don Brash, is now the most popular party in the country.
And this tells the story. National out ahead on 45. That's a 17-point jump since December. Labor will see...
With polls showing Don Brash could be the next Prime Minister, corporate lobbyists shifted gear.
Hello, Riley.
The answer, in fact, is to have a more productive economy. Right. And how you get a more productive economy, certainly one of the ways of doing that is to have less taxes.
In today's open economies, a sensible planned program of tax cuts would be very manageable given the fiscal situation New Zealand's in.
Now, I'm sure, John Key, that's what you're going to say you're going to do.
A national government would lower the tax burden on working New Zealanders, it would lower the tax burden on companies. We won't put on a carbon tax that's going to cost households around $900 a year.
National framed climate change is another trendy left-wing distraction.
Look, I think the country is sick and tired of 6 years of PC social engineering from this government. I think mainstream New Zealanders want some tax relief. Made it clear we'll scrap the carbon tax. That's all part of the tax package.
Within the different organisations, you had different perceptions around the election, which was a major window of opportunity that the lobbyists were quite aggressive in exploiting. The Road Transport Association was a key player in oil and gas and Business New Zealand.
Many of the competitors of New Zealand business aren't going to be paying this tax. Australia, America, China won't be paying this tax.
The Greenhouse Policy Coalition commissioned another report from Alex Zundakov.
There's no doubt that as we go forward, the liability that New Zealand will be incurring under Kyoto will increase. I think we have to think very seriously again about our domestic policies.
Cometh the hour, cometh the man, Mr. Winston Peters!
As the election approached, the gap between National and Labour narrowed.
We will peak on election day. We'll turn these polls upside down.
The lobbyists realised that under MMP, the minor parties are very powerful. They said, well, we use facts and figures with officials and we use threats and softer kind of emotional arguments with politicians.
They call you up in your office and come and give you a personal rundown on what you're doing wrong, or if you happen to agree with them, what you're doing right. You're expected to take their view of the world as the only view, and if you don't agree with it, devastation will follow as well.
Their plan was fit for purpose, it was coordinated, it was intense, and it targeted the people who had the power to make a difference.
John Key is absolutely right. We shouldn't be hobbling ourselves with taxes that our major trading partners, Australia, the United States, China, aren't signing up to. We should be getting right out of that tax immediately.
Rod Donald, Kyoto non-negotiable for the Greens?
Kyoto is one of the biggest challenges facing this planet. You can't put your head in the sands like Rodney and John. We've got to tackle it. That's the challenge, to get our emissions down by 37 million tonnes by the end of this period. And I believe New Zealand can do it. And that's our international responsibility. Otherwise there'll be no Tokelau's, there'll be no Tuvalus, because they'll be flooded.
Oh, OK.
Just briefly, Jim Anderson.
Given your opposition to the Greens, you don't like them at all, would you sit around the cabinet table with them?
Well, I'm someone who's got a very strong commitment to our environment. I actually think our Greens are watermelons. They're green on the outside, red on the inside. I think that's what you were getting at before.
What are you suggesting? Communists?
I'm suggesting that they've got subsumed into a whole lot of other causes that are not mainstream green causes.
United Future, New Zealand First and ACT joined National in opposing Pete Hodgson's carbon charge.
We are dependent on climate for the basis, the engine room of our economy, which is primary production. So let's ask ourselves whether or not a $500 million drought each year somewhere in the country is more important. Can we please join up the dots here and get a bit of perspective? I'm sorry that I'm coming on strongly, but it's about time we started to face the fact that climate change is coming, ready or not, and we are going to have to, as a nation, as a world, address it.
Labour retained power, but only just, signing coalition agreements with United Future and New Zealand First.
I can remember saying to my staff on the Tuesday or something after the election, have you guys worked it out? The work over the last 6 years now stops. We can't do this anymore. We're not going to have a carbon tax because of bit players in the MMP system. My policy got negotiated away.
I'm deeply disappointed, in fact I'm gutted, that the government has decided to give up on its target of getting carbon emissions down.
Soon after the election, New Zealand's richest man Graham Hart gained full control of Carterholt Harvey and began converting its forests into dairy farms. Cutting down the trees meant New Zealand lost CO2 credits under Kyoto. New Zealand taxpayers would be liable for deforestation charges of $66 million. Graham Hart stood to make over $200 million.
Normally, Senior Minister rings the company through his office and says, look, good idea if we had a chat about what's happening and exchange views. I've never struck a time when that doesn't happen, except for him. You couldn't even speak to him. You're not allowed to talk to him. We would ring and he would say, his answer phone system would say no, not available, never available, ever. It wasn't just me, it was anyone. Amazing.
Soon, Auckland rich listers were buying more forests to convert to dairy farms.
It looked like the Martians had invaded. I mean, they're just bowling whole forests down. And suddenly, the forests that we had there giving us credits were disappearing like a pound of butter on a hot day in the Sahara Desert.
We are seeing unprecedented price levels in the marketplace at the moment. And of course, this has brought forward a lot of interest that there may have been to convert to dairying, and commerce will always ensure that land use activity always gravitates towards where it is most profitable.
Whoa! Oh, shivers! Oh my God, that's the whole cave gone!
By 2006, New Zealand was producing 25% more greenhouse gases than in 1990.
What many systems are vulnerable to is extremes, and we've talked about the possibility of more intense tropical cyclones, more heavy rainfall in New Zealand.
This ongoing coastal development is very likely to increase risk to lives and property from sea level rise and storms.
Is the weather getting worse?
It's certainly changed. I don't think there's any doubt at all. People say it's a 100-year flood, but if we're in a period when you've got rapid change, then your opinion of what constitutes a 100-year flood will have to be adjusted.
Where would be the safest place in New Zealand to live in terms of being protected from the weather?
Or perhaps a penthouse suite in the Beehive.
The new minister responsible for climate change was David Parker. He'd been in Parliament for just 3 years.
I'm surrounded by some pretty competent and experienced people, and I'm sure with their help and their guidance that they'll give it a good shot. The mantra that we ran on for the first 6 months after we had lost the carbon tax fight was very simple. It was, we ought not to be debating whether climate change is real, we ought to be debating what we should do about it.
We are causing global warming. I am Al Gore. I used to be the next president of the United States of America.
From Paramount Classics comes a film that has shocked audiences everywhere they've seen it.
If you look at the 10 hottest years ever measured, they've all occurred in the last 14 years. And the hottest of all, 2005.
An Inconvenient Truth, Al Gore's movie, came out. That was quite a tipping point in terms of New Zealand's public awareness and concern about the issue. And I think it went from being something that was debated to a lot of people just going, oh, it's real, the debate's over.
We showed it at Labour Party conferences. I went to various screenings around the country. Some of them were put on by us, others were put on by, I remember Lloyd Morrison from Infratil, I think it was, put on some screenings of An Inconvenient Truth. And, you know, so there was a business leader putting his weight behind a need to do something.
Al Gore came to Auckland to talk to politicians and business leaders.
Every country in the world has to do more, and I think there's an encouraging set of signs that many people are beginning to do a lot more.
I never really knew until today just how significant it was.
and how little time we actually have. I think what he's done fantastically is taken scientific information that's been lost or not able to be easily accessed by people like ourselves, and he's translated it.
Mr. Gore, do you please sign our petition?
Issues around sustainability and climate change have become the compelling issues of our times. I do believe that in the years to come, the pride we take in our quest for sustainability and carbon neutrality will define our nation, as our quest for a nuclear-free world has over the past 23 years. Thank you.
Helen Clark's speech, it was actually a very brave move on Helen's part. I mean, politicians normally don't commit to things that they don't think they can do. And we were a minority government and we didn't have the numbers in the bag. We brought together a whole of government group, whether it was the Minister of Transport, the Minister of Agriculture and Forestry or Energy. Everyone was prevailed upon to provide a senior official, not a mid-ranked official, but someone who was top of their game. And that team of people really did bring some intellectual grunt and some power from within their own ministries to make progress.
We think this is an integrated package. This looks at emissions reductions that might be achieved across the economy in the longer term, and this is an issue that's come to a head with climate change, which, as we all know now, has the potential to have a dramatic impact on our lives. It really is achievable, and it's not too expensive for New Zealand. It's cheaper than anywhere else in the world. Happy to answer questions.
Early in 2007, Mighty River Power dropped plans to open a coal-fired power station at Marsden Point.
There's geothermal projects being built, there's wind projects being built, and there are additional projects in planning stage. We're building the largest geothermal plant that's been built in more than 20 years at Carrail right now.
This is a huge victory, not only for Greenpeace and the community groups that have fought this project from the beginning, but it's also a great victory for the climate.
I apologise for the fact that those of us in the industry haven't done a great deal to capture carbon on our coal-fired plants in the last 45 years that I've worked in the industry. All of the generators, including Genesis, are in pursuit of wind generation. We're in pursuit of geothermal, more hydro where we can, and of course solar as well.
We really were making a big difference during that period. Whereas a carbon tax was off the agenda, the possibility of a different form of emissions pricing through an emissions trading scheme remained. We'd got to the point where we had a very well-designed scheme.
In September 2007, the government announced plans for an emissions trading scheme.
These are solutions which are fair, flexible and effective for all sectors of New Zealand business and society.
In an emissions trading scheme, you're capping the volume of emissions and people can trade amongst themselves where those emissions within that cap can be best reduced or trade a reduction for an increase somewhere within that overall environmental cap.
New National Party leader John Key supported emissions trading.
Well, you've got to remember, if you go right back to the 1990 Cabinet, we thought a price-based mechanism was the right way to undertake.
Rather than tax.
Yeah. And the reason being that it allows you to actually price the value on both the environment and the production of, let's say, energy in this case.
The devil here will be in the detail. How do you make it work? By what time? Who gets involved first? If New Zealand does this poorly and we get into emissions trading too early, we'll be paying costs that our competitors aren't paying.
The whole of Europe has emissions pricing. Australia is now talking about having emissions trading from 2010. Other than in forestry, ours starts in 2009, so it's pretty much within cooey.
They're saying that we shouldn't move ahead of it.
We tried to harness the goodwill and the efforts of some powerful people within New Zealand. We created a climate change leadership forum.
Price responsive. It was a very useful device to bring together 40 or 50 diverse
representatives of industry and interests in climate change, expose his ETS policy work to that group, and I thought it was a really good way of improving the quality of the policy work.
Solid Energy CEO Don Elder and Roger Kerr of the Business Roundtable asked to join the forum, but were refused. Solid Energy, a state-owned enterprise, then secretly commissioned a report on the cost of the ETS to consumers and companies. The Business Roundtable brought out Nigel Lawson, Margaret Thatcher's Secretary for Energy.
There's no global warming happening at the present time. That is clear. That's accepted on all sides of the argument.
Al Gore, former US Vice President, do you see him as doing a good job in at least raising awareness, or is he a scaremonger?
I think he's a scaremonger.
Really?
Absolutely.
New Zealand is one of some countries looking at an emissions trading scheme as a way of regulating this. What's the matter with that?
I think that's a mistaken policy. I think it would damage the New Zealand economy to no benefit.
Greenpeace has taken action today at the New Vale coal mine in Southland. This coal mine is supplying Fonterra's dairy processing factory at Edendale, and we're seeing a massive expansion in Fonterra's burning and mining of coal.
New Zealand is a bit like a company town. There's one big company in town and it's Fonterra in the dairy industry. And it's quite hard for the government to do things that upset the company.
Agriculture's inclusion into the emissions trading scheme was delayed until 2013.
It's very hard to be bullish about something that's going to put more compliance down on the farm, but we are in a democracy.
There was a period of time with the farmers, in my opinion, that the ETS was not recognised quite as a replacement for the carbon tax. And when they realised that it was, and in their opinion worse, then they really got up on their hind legs and really got to work on the National Party.
You've won a lot of prizes, haven't you? What do you do with the ribbon? I've actually got one in my office.
Federated Farmers worked with the ACT Party and the sort of rural part of the National Party to develop a resistance to the ETS. So Nationals started dropping hints about an even greater delay.
I knew I was going to enjoy coming to this milking shed, but when I came and saw that the cows get to look at blue all day, I realised it was my kind of milking shed.
Over half of our emissions come from agriculture. No one at this stage has a solution to CO2 emissions from agriculture, so it would literally involve destocking our farms.
Whenever I go to New Zealand and talk to the farming groups, I get intensely frustrated because there's this great fear that somehow engaging with the issue and accounting for carbon will leave them in a position of liability. And I just think that is absolutely untrue. We're seeing symptoms of a shifting climate almost everywhere we look. We've had those bushfires in Victoria. A 47 degrees Celsius day in Melbourne was just unthinkable before. The basic story as far as the science goes is rock solid. The natural cycles won't go away. There've been droughts before, there've been warm summers before and everything else. All we're doing is shifting the average, but shifting it on a very steep trajectory that will bring about profound change unless we do something about it.
Call on Government Order of the Day number 5.
Climate Change, Emissions Trading and Renewable Preference Bill, first reading.
Mr Speaker.
It then came down to whether we could pass it in the House. We effectively had a fully designed emissions trading scheme and we had it legislated.
The bill went to a select committee of MPs to hear public submissions.
Achieved in the way of emission reductions. In this bill, we have the toughest and potentially most expensive solution to this problem in the world, and that other countries are unlikely to follow us with similar stringency.
Our annual independent valuations show that we have lost more than $75 million in falling land values. We are all sitting around here tearing our hair out on what the result of that is imposing a cost on us.
A lot of submitters are coming to the committee saying we really support emissions trading as long as we're selling, not buying, and as long as it's not going to cost us anything. The climate deniers all came along and they all showed the same graph, which started in 1998, which was a real spike in temperature for a whole lot of reasons. It was an outlier, outstandingly hot year. They showed this as the beginning of their graphs and then showed there hadn't really been much warming since then. In fact, it had gone down after 98.
Using the report secretly paid for by Solid Energy, opponents of the bill claimed tens of thousands of jobs would be lost.
So the case needs to be put to the public, we say, with proper analysis and an honest assessment of the costs, because unstable policies serve neither economic nor environmental interests.
Pay it because you have to, but I don't necessarily agree that's the best policy.
No, someone's got to pay for it. We're all part of this planet.
Hello, mate. How's very good luck for the election. Thanks very much.
The 2008 election was approaching. National was ahead in the polls.
It's not the sole issue for the election. Obviously, people are worried about fuel prices.
Well, I don't know whether you think you're going to get votes by saying, well, we're going to put another 10 cents a litre on your petrol next year to pay for emissions trading, because I honestly don't think you will.
You've got to take people with you, David. That's the problem I see. You've got to take people with you.
I absolutely... But, you know, there is a groundswell of people out there. People are worried about environmental matters. The reality is climate change is a serious problem for us and for our children. And if a country like New Zealand can't do its bit and get it under control, what hope is there for the world, Chris?
Officially over.
With the election just 6 months away, Helen Clark dropped petrol levies from the scheme.
We can take this opportunity to ease the burden on households and business.
You know, it's Helen Clark in full retreat mode, isn't it? I mean, all of the rhetoric about carbon neutrality just went up in a pile of CO2 emissions.
This back down on the government, will the Greens pull their support from Labor?
We are going to look at the emissions trading scheme, because if it doesn't make progress on reducing greenhouse emissions, what's the point of it?
Greenpeace is using the Rainbow Warrior and climbers to prevent this coal shipment from leaving Littleton. We're bringing attention to the fact that in this country, the politicians and especially the government are not doing enough on climate change.
We released a report critiquing the emissions trading scheme. Our analysis was that it was vastly inadequate and was incredibly weak.
The criticisms that we were getting from the environmental lobby that it wasn't good enough were hurting us as well. We felt like we didn't have any friends anywhere. So I called a meeting of some of the people who you would expect to be supportive of what we were about.
Almost all the other environmental groups were pretty upset about it. And I was pretty well the only person saying, well, you know, if this helps it get through the election, maybe it was worth it.
We really wanted to see the emissions trading scheme strengthened significantly, but it was the only option on the table, and so we wanted to at least see that get through.
Just a couple of quick questions around...
The Select Committee hearings continued. A senior executive of the foreign-owned Tiwai Point smelter made an appearance.
She swept into the room, she sat down and started lecturing us as though we were some really tin pot little third world country.
Rio Tinto, as an international business, will continue to support the New Zealand operation as long as it is cost effective and competitive. Frankly, it may not be so if the bill is passed in its current form.
She had an attitude that this was a load of nonsense. We don't like it. We own the company. This is New Zealand. If you do this to us, we'll close it down. End of story. National, they were nodding their head, oh yes, 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 they were agreeing with all of this.
Do you take Rio Tinto's threats seriously yesterday?
Rio Tinto Zinc is not required to reduce their emissions until around 2018-19 and then have a 12-year phase out. That is not excessively strenuous.
We're in the middle of a really intense select committee process. We had submissions for 3 days last week. We're back into it again tomorrow. We've got a number of quite serious concerns.
Without National, there's a high probability they can't push this legislation through.
If the government's going to ride roughshod of those sorts of industries' concerns, no, National will not be part of it.
National's expected to announce its position on Sunday. Do you expect to have their support for the scheme as it is proposed now?
Well, they said they support emissions trading in preference to emissions trading, so they'll have some explaining to do if they don't support it.
They said they may not support the structure that you're proposing right now.
Well, they might try and find some excuse to not support it, but time will tell.
In aiming to fly to the moon, Labour have not even got airborne. It should not attempt to make New Zealand a world leader on climate change. Kiwis simply cannot afford to pay the price for that particular experiment.
The government's flagship plan to combat global warming is hanging by a thread as National withdraws support for the controversial emissions trading scheme.
We've known we can never rely upon National, and this just proves the point, despite this being an issue that you'd think people would rise above petty politics for.
We're not viewing it from a political perspective, we're viewing it from what is the right environmental legislation for New Zealand.
Do you think you can pass this?
Well, I've been talking personally to leaders of some of the parties. Greens are keen to keep talking, New Zealand First is keen to keep talking. They see the issue's got to be dealt with.
But they are shaky.
Oh, no, it's not a question of anyone being shaky. The question is, as with any bill, when you're a minority government, you need to sit down and hammer through the details with people.
National's coalition ally, ACT, received a campaign donation of $100,000 from Alan Gibbs, Business Roundtable member and climate change sceptic.
The entire climate change global warming hypothesis is a hoax. The emissions trading scheme is a worldwide scam and swindle.
If the ETS passes before the election and National becomes the government, then we'll be changing the ETS to reflect our principles.
Corporate executives were now demanding meetings with David Parker.
They wanted delay. Delay could change the outcome from their perspective, because if it wasn't passed, then I think they thought they would be able to have a good chance of being no emissions trading scheme. We had disputes with solid energy, the steel industry, the cement industry, the gas lobby, the wider coal lobby, some of the transport groups, of course federated farmers.
We've got 700 supplementary order papers in the Parliament. That is just a circus. That is just no way to be passing one of the most significant pieces of legislation that we'll have in business and in New Zealand in the next 20 years.
So I said to my colleagues, look, I'm a relatively junior minister, as I was at the time. I'm having to fight all of these different battles. So various people around the cabinet table said that they would take one of these arguments on themselves rather than it being me the pushing back against all of them.
I'd invite them in, come in, talk, fine. But there's no guarantee I'll agree with you, but I'll listen to you.
We effectively put down a scrum the other way, led by the Prime Minister having staked her reputation on this ground, and we pushed back the other way.
Any of these measures have got a cost to them when you're looking at issues like climate change, peak oil and so on. And what we've got to do is to rethink our approach to transport.
The taxpayers of the country are not inordinately penalised. Firms such as oil companies, energy producers are going to have to modify their behaviour, or they are going to face a heavier levy.
Not to proceed with that legislation is to inflict on the New Zealand taxpayer hundreds of millions of dollars of cost, and that is avoidable.
And the key here is the support of New Zealand First.
Well, the key is to muster 61 votes from across a range of parties.
Winston Peters.
Well, it may or may not, but we are discussing it with a range of parties.
It was a very finely balanced decision for the Greens. We went out and consulted widely, and we invited submissions. 3,000 people wrote in over a weekend to our website
should we support or shouldn't we? And that rang strongly in favour. Yes, support, it's not perfect by any means, but maybe it's a start and we can build on it. So with some trepidation and reluctance, we decided to support it because there was no other game in town to do anything at all about climate change.
We're very appreciative of the Greens' support for the ETS bill. We've been talking with them for a long time about climate change issues ever since we first came into government. We're continuing to talk to New Zealand First, but we're expecting to hear from them in the not too distant future.
In the end, it would come down to Winston Peters. I found him very straightforward in our dealings. The first meetings that we had about it were evening meetings over a bottle of whiskey, actually.
Did you discuss it in caucus today?
Yes, we did. But unfortunately, I had one away with the flu and one down the South Island, and we've got work to do still.
So you're pretty happy with what's on the table at the moment?
Oh, look, I can't presage what caucus will decide.
Isn't time running out though? You have a good day, guys.
What happened in the caucus, they wouldn't support it. And it got pretty heated. I got to the stage where, you know, like, you guys sort it out. I've told you what it is, how you can explain it away, how you can deal with our members who are not going to be happy with it, how you can talk to the public about it. But still that argument went. But in the end, yeah, we did support it, and rightly so.
Peter Brown.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, let me assure the House that New Zealand First supports this bill, and let me assure the Minister we're supporting it in the right spirit.
Tonight, we pass a small step towards getting New Zealand's carbon emissions under control. And I want to pay tribute to the Minister David Parker. While the Greens don't agree with everything about the design of this, I really believe that he has done everything he can in the current political environment to take this first step towards reducing our emissions.
I am proud that today, with this legislation, New Zealand has risen to meet one of the great challenges of our time, that of climate change. I therefore commend this bill to the House.
Thank you, Tim. The ayes are 63, the noes are 57. The ayes have it. I call on Government Order of the Day number 4.
On the 25th of September 2008, the New Zealand Emissions Trading Scheme passed into law. Six weeks later, John Key became Prime Minister, supported by United Future, ACT and the Māori Party.
Ladies and gentlemen, today, New Zealand has spoken.
Within a few weeks, National scrapped a moratorium on building new fossil-fuelled power stations. Over time, agriculture's inclusion in the emissions trading scheme was postponed indefinitely. Corporations were freed to increase emissions without limit. New Zealand abandoned its commitment to the Kyoto Protocol process. Between 1990 and 2013, New Zealand's burning of fossil fuels doubled. Overall emissions tripled. The rate of increase was amongst the highest in the developed world.